If you'll take your Bibles, we'll turn to the book of Exodus, and we'll begin in chapter 20, but we're going to work our way through the book all the way to chapter 20 as we go through this morning's lesson. The text for this morning is in your handout. It's Exodus 20, verse 2, and I hope to have our monthly verse be the text for our lesson when it's in the passages that we will be reading. I think it will be a help to us. It will help me. It'll actually help me figure out what 12 of my lessons text should be. So, because there's like the whole Bible in 52 lessons. So, that'll help with that. But it will help us too, because as we come up to it, hopefully we'll be able to have something about the verse, and depending on how the verse fits in the month's reading, it might be toward the beginning or toward the end, or if it fits into some Sunday when we don't have Sunday school, we will just memorize the verse that month and not have a lesson about it. But anyway, Exodus chapter 20, verse 2. I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Now, if you recognize that, if you've been a student of the Bible for some time, I would say anybody in here who grew up in a Christian home, or if you've been a Christian for a while, you, I think, would recognize that Exodus chapter 20 is the chapter of the Ten Commandments. And this verse, actually verses 1 and 2, is referred to as the Preamble to the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments were the words of God spoken to, I'm going to get the wrong word, but to establish his covenant with the people of Israel, with the children of Israel. And so the title of my lesson is The Preamble to the Covenant. So I would like us to get some context to this, and so we're going to just begin with what happened before this time. Actually, as we think of the book of Exodus, chapter 20, this verse and the 10 words, which is what the Ten Commandments means, that follow, it's what the whole book is working toward, and everything after it is a result of these 10 Commandments. So this is the centerpiece of the book of Exodus. So before this time, I would say we start Exodus, and the children of Israel are what I'm going to say are singled out in Egypt. They are in Egypt, and they were there because God sent a famine to drive his Jacob and his family down into Egypt. If you think about it, Jacob and his children were his sons had wives. His daughter had been taken by whatever his name is, Shechem. Yeah, Shechem. I was thinking that's the name of a city, and it is, but either way. So there was this huge possibility of the children of Israel just melting into the Canaanite culture. If we look at it from an anthropological point of view. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and his family, there was a huge possibility of them just disappearing into Canaanite culture. And God had chosen, he said through them, he was going to bless his people, bless the world. And so the Messiah, as he would come to be known in the progressive revelation of Scripture, was going to come from there. And as we find in Galatians, God had set Israel with its laws to protect his seed so that it could come from a godly group of people. So he drives, in a sense, with the famine, he drives Jacob's family, the children of Israel, into Egypt. And there's enough distinction between them and those around them that they flourish as a people. Over time, a Pharaoh arises that doesn't know Joseph, and he puts them in bondage. He doesn't put anybody else in bondage, only the children of Israel. And so that's why I'm saying they are singled out. They are kind of carved out as a distinct group of people there, and they're put in bondage. We see that in chapter 1. And they cry out. And so then in chapters 2, 3, and 4, somewhere about there, we learn about Moses and his family and the different things that happen in his life, and how he's reared in Pharaoh's house, and then goes into the wilderness, and God sends him back to Egypt to deliver his people, who are now carved out, a group, an entity there in Egypt, out of Egypt. He runs into Pharaoh. We meet Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is like, Jehovah, I've never heard of him. Pharaoh had heard of lots of gods, lots and lots and lots of gods, many, many gods, but he never heard of Jehovah. Who is he? I'm not going to send these people out to worship some guy I've never heard of. And so then we read of all the plagues that God sends into the land of Egypt. And finally, we read of the redemption of the people of Israel. They were slaves, and so they had to be bought. They had to be redeemed. And they were redeemed out of Israel in Exodus chapter 12. Also in Exodus chapter 12, we read of the first institution of the Passover. It is the time when the angel passes over the houses of those that have the blood on the doorpost and the lintel. But it's also when they first practice the Passover meal. And there's rich symbolism in there, going all the way to Christ, who is our Passover, crucified on the Passover with the Passover lambs in the same way. But so that's Exodus chapter 12. And then the children of Israel are out of Egypt. They're pursued by the Egyptian army, and they are killed in the crossing of the Red Sea. After they get across the Red Sea, they're following. They have God's direction. They're following the cloudy pillar in the sky, or a pillar of fire at night. And God leads them away from Canaan. If you would think of a map of the area, they'd come, get my directions mirrored for you guys. I'm not going to get this straight. But they'd come out of Egypt, and they come out of Egypt, and they would just go right up into Canaan, but instead, he leads them south into more wilderness. There's all wilderness along there, but going south just means more wilderness to go through to finally get to their land that God had promised them as a people. And as he leads them south, they run out of water. You remember? They can't find water. Then they find water, and it's bitter. And then God provides a way to sweeten the water. They leave there, and they have lots of water and palm trees. And as they leave there, they run out of food. And God sends food. He sends quail in the night, or in the evening, enough so that everybody could eat, which later on we're going to get counts of the people, 2 sets of the counts of the people, and there's over 600,000 men, and we know there's families, wives and children. Most people conservatively, and I would say probably very conservatively, estimate that there was 2 million people. And the reason I would say very conservatively is because the children of Israel went from 70 people in the time of Jacob, and not counting wives and some other, but generally 70, 74, something like that. When you read it, there's a couple different ways of counting. But let's just say it's double that, to be generous. 150, and 4, 5, 6 generations, depending on how we read that, there are over 600,000 men. There was a lot of kids in those families. And if we just say there was 1.5 kids in the families that came out of Egypt, you got over 2 million people. So anyway, God provides food, quail in the night, and then he establishes this process of leaving bread on the ground every morning, except for on the Sabbath day. And that begins 38, 39 years of God providing food for them, 40 years of God providing food. So he sends manna. After that begins, Amalek comes to fight against them. And you can imagine, Amalek's used to just wandering wherever they want to in the wilderness, and here comes 2 million people with all their animals, and they're eating up all the pasture for these nomad Amalekites. Say, we got to get these people out of here. We're going to starve to death. Anyway, they attack the rear of the people, the people that are slower and weaker, and God provides protection and victory over them. In the story when Moses goes up on the mountain and raises his rod above his head during their battle. Soon after that, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, comes to meet with, to see Moses in the wilderness. That's where Jethro lived, was in the wilderness. So he comes to see him, and he sees that Moses is the one ruler of the people of Israel. And Moses sits all day long listening to every little bickering complaint that people couldn't resolve among themselves. They brought it to Moses. And he says, you're going to die doing this. And Jethro helps Moses, gives him a system of government. I mean, if we want to be honest about it, he gives him a system of government. Appoint these people, you teach them, and then only the hard cases come to you. So what kind of people have a government? A nation, a group of people. They have a system and all of this. So they kind of set up this government, and people have said that this is man-made government. But Jethro even says to Moses, if you do this and God says it's the way to go, follow this instruction. So Jethro acknowledges that it should be something that God would approve of, and they set this up. This system, and then in the very next chapter, God calls Moses and Aaron, and there's this all back and forth about, I have called you out of Egypt, I'm going to set you up as a peculiar people, my people, and I'm going to establish a covenant with you. It's me and you are going to establish this covenant. I will do this if you will do this. And he comes to Moses, and the people of Israel, the leaders, the people of Israel says, all that the Lord has said, we will do. Okay, that's not a verbatim, but all that the Lord has said, we will do. And so, then, this is an agreement. We tend to think that God sits up here and he just tells people what to do. But throughout the Old Testament, we see almost always there's a covenantal agreement, and it is something that he gives the people he's making his covenant with an opportunity to accept. That's a governmental point throughout the Old Testament. So the covenant then follows this. So we come up to, through all of that happening, God is saying to the people of Israel, I'm going to do this through Moses and all that, and they agree. And then chapter 20, verse 1 says, and God spoke all these words. So chapter 19, verse 25 says, so Moses went down unto the people and spoke unto them. So Moses has been going back and forth between God and the people, and they have agreed to do what God has said. And so then now God is going to speak to the people of Israel. And he says, and so God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. No other gods. So he goes in, right from there, he goes into the 10 Commandments. So before we get into our verse, hopefully I have time, let's just think a little bit about the covenant that follows, and there's some unique attributes to this. These words in chapter 20 are the only words that were spoken by God verbally and personally. There is times when he came from the cloud and said, "This is my beloved son." But the rest of the law he gave to Moses and all this. But these words, he spoke out of the fiery cloud, off the mountain, spoke these words to all the people. They're spoken by God. And these are the only words written by God personally. Yes, he did write on the wall, or the hand of God wrote on the wall for Belshazzar. But really, the rest of the Bible, God spoke or moved along men of God, and they wrote out his words and all that. But these words are unique in this sense that God spoke them and he wrote them with his own hand on the tables of stone. There's some characteristics of this law that I want to point out. It's short and it's simple. It is actually 10 words. When you read the Bible, talks about them in Deuteronomy 4:13, he says 10 commandments. In Deuteronomy 10:4, 10 commandments. There are 10 words. Of course, we don't understand the Hebrew, but the Hebrew there's 10 commandments, and somehow what we read in those commandments, and some of them are short, "Thou shalt not kill," are all embodied in those 10 words. That is why you may have heard it called the Decalogue. If you've heard it called the Decalogue, you recognize, I guess it would be some Latin in there. The deca is 10, and the log, or logos, is word, 10 words. So it's the 10 words, it's the Decalogue, it's the 10 commandments. Another characteristic of it I'd like to point out is that it's complete and yet concise. If a person could keep every single one of these laws, there would be nothing else they would need to worry about. It's complete. And it's concise, it's short, it's pretty simple. You would think, wouldn't you? This life is simple. All you have to do is remember 10 things. Just remember and keep these 10 things. There's really no set of laws that's shorter, no set of, like a body of morality that is shorter or more complete than the 10 commandments, except for Jesus' abridgment of it when he said, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy soul, all thy strength, all thy might." I'm getting the words wrong. "And thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." So love God, love your neighbor. On these two hang all the law and the prophets. That would be an abridgment of it, a shorter statement of it. But this is it. It's complete, but it's concise. Another thing I'd like to mention about it is that it is individually personal. Now, God was speaking this to how many people? 2 million, whatever. How many men? Let's just say he spoke it to the men and they were the responsible parties. Over 600,000 men. But what does he say? He says, "thou." Now, we don't use "thou" that much anymore, but "thou" is the singular second person pronoun. Right, Mrs. Marquez? She doesn't know. She's not going to correct the teacher, even though she knows. It's the singular second person pronoun. We all just use "you." You could be you, or you could be y'all. I don't say y'all. You all. Okay? So, right? In common usage, we use you and you to mean anyone. But in the Bible, in a good Bible, in the King James Version of the Bible, we see ye, which is plural, and thou, which is singular. The point I'm getting at is God said this to all of them, but he addressed every single one individually. "Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt have no other gods before me." So it demands attention, and it demands obedience. The Jewish people today say, well, of course, no one can keep all 623 laws, but as a people, as a people, we keep God's laws. Where I fall short of keeping the laws, my brother, my Jewish brother, he keeps those laws, and so as a people, we are keeping the law of God. God said you. God said thou, not ye. Thou. And so every single one that heard that, and in inference, each of us that read it, are expected individually to keep these laws. It demands obedience. It demands attention. Then, one more thing about the laws is that they were unconditional rather than conditional. Now, later on, we have statutes written to kind of say how this will work out. But these laws are unconditional. They don't say, if a person does this, then that. Or if a person does this, then that. They're unconditional. There's no penalties attached to these laws. It just says, don't do it, or do it. It's not a bunch of other things. In fact, in a certain sense, there's no penalties attached because these people were not slaves. They were free. There was just, now do this, you're free. And that's kind of the point of the verse that we're going to be looking at. They were free men, and these laws were to bear upon their conscience as free men. There are statutes that follow, but the law, the 10 words, has none. One last thing before we get into our text is the division of them. Some people say there's 5 and 5. There's 5 that are maybe vertical and 5 horizontal, up to, because of honoring parents being a kind of a vertical relationship, and then 6 through 10 are horizontal. Augustine, the beloved of the Reformers and the Catholics, theologian, says there was 3 and 7. And I just mentioned this because somebody mentioned it a couple weeks ago as we were talking about the Catholics. Catholics believe there's, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 3. And then there's 7. Honor thy father and your mother, which is number 4. You're catching this? We skipped over one in the way we look at that. Which one did they skip over? For Catholic people, there's no commandment that says, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. Lo and behold, it's not against the 10 commandments to have images in your Catholic church. How convenient. Anyway, so there's that. Some people say 4 and 6. Some people say 10 and 10. Some people say this was a covenant. And so all 10 were on one table, and there's a copy of it on the other table. It's kind of an interesting thing I ran into as I was studying. So in the last 3 minutes, let's look at our text. And I think I can do this, but you're going to have to think about it more next Sunday morning when you do this reading, chapters 19 through 21. Here we go. He says, I am the Lord. I'm Jehovah. I'm Jehovah. Jehovah is the personal name of God. So he comes and says, I'm Jehovah. And the personal name of God, this is his name that indicates he's God because he is. I am that I am. Remember, maybe in Exodus chapter 4, you're going to read that. I am that I am sent me. He's God because he is. No one created him. He is the being that gives being to other creatures. He gives being to all creatures, and since he has created us, since he gives us that being, he can also give whatever laws he pleases to those beings. And then he says, then the next little phrase says, thy God. I am Jehovah, thy God. And this we should just think back to chapter 19, where he comes to them and says, I'll be your God, will you be my people? And they say, yes, we will be your people. All that the Lord has said on us, we will do. He is their personal God in a special and peculiar manner. He was going to make them a peculiar people, a special people. And in that sense, he said he would be their king. They, in chapter 18, set up some type of form of government. He comes to them and says, will you be my people? I will be your God. I will be your king. And every king has laws given for his people's best governing. So he says, I'm Jehovah. I'm the God that gives you your being. And since I give you your being, I can give you laws for your betterment. I'm your God and your king. And since I'm your God, I have laws. I'm your king. I have laws for you to follow so that your life runs well within my kingdom. And then he says, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt. So everything here about in this verse, we should see that God is personal. he uses his personal name. He says, me and you, we have this connection. I am thy God, and I do things, and I've done things for you personally. You were in Egypt, and now you're not in Egypt. I've acted on your behalf with my almighty power. And you've come out of Egypt. You were slaves in Egypt, and you come out with riches. Remember? They spoiled the Egyptians. They took their gold and took these things. God told them to, so they come out of Egypt. They were slaves, and they come out with riches. He had tender compassion on them. He heard their cries. He took care of them. And this puts them, everyone that is cared for and loved by anyone like that, is under obligation to that person. So they're under obligation to yield obedience to God. And then he says, out of the house of bondage. I brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. They were servants. They were slaves. And now they are free. They had freely established their own government. They were a body politic. And so God would enact the laws that they would follow. So, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. This is 3,500 years old, but yet God is our God too. The same God that said that then is the God that we worship today, and he gave us our being. Even though we have hospitals where we come into being, we have doctors, we know it's God that gave us our being. And since he made us, he can tell us what to do. And he's ours personally, and in an even more personal sense than the people of Israel. God came to the people of Israel in thunder and lightning and fire and smoke billowing up to heaven and a tremendous voice that scared them to death and spoke to them. And then 1,500 years later, he came in the form of a man. And he lived among us. And he showed his tender compassion, right? He showed he was God. He showed his mighty power. He healed people. He raised the dead. And then he died. And he speaks to us. And he invites us into a personal relationship with him, who actually became a man. And so God is our God through Jesus Christ and our personal relationship to him. And if we love him, we will keep his commandments. And then God is our Redeemer, and I kind of merged that in there. Christ came and saved us. God saved the people of Israel out of Egypt, out of bondage, and he saves us. And God desires, so just in our last way of thinking, God desires obedience that springs from love. Now, we might say that we understand that now, but in the Old Testament it was different. But the point of this passage, and one of the major points of my lesson, is that God has not changed. God has always been a God of mercy and a God of love. He's always been a redeemer, and he always expected obedience out of love for himself, not just motions that fit a certain shape for him. And, we might understand that more these days and say it was that way in the Old Testament, and yet we fall ourselves into this pattern of living where we just fit a certain shape and say, well, since I'm in this shape, I'm okay. And God expects us to love him. And in a certain sense, expects, that's not the right word. We ought to love him. Look at everything he's done for us. Obedience to him should not be any strain on our lives because of what he's done for us. And so let's remember these things this week as you are reading, building up toward this passage. And like I say, actually next Sunday we'll read this. If you read in the morning, you'll have read it before we come together. And hopefully this will be a help to us as we go through the scriptures this week.